Hey folks, today I want to take you through a real life rebrand process for one of my clients called Fresh Productions. They are an event and management and production company, and they wanted to completely refresh their brand identity, and they chose me as the guy for the job. So I'm going to take you through all of the stages that I went through with this client to show you how we gave them an amazing new brand identity to help promote their business. So let's jump over to the computer and I'll take you through everything. So quick overview here. This is a document that holds some of the workings of creating a new brand identity. It's sort of my thoughts and some sketches and stuff, and we will go through that as we go through this journey. So one of the first things that I want to do with a client, obviously, is we want to look and discuss their existing brand. What do they have? What's working for them? What's not working for them? And why do they want to go through the rebrand process? What's the problem that they're trying to solve? And so I had a meeting with Ben. We did everything by video call. I'm in Scotland. Ben, the client, is in Wales. And we had some initial chats where I asked those questions, what the problems were. And it really came down to the fact that Ben had a great company offering a great service, but he just didn't feel that his branding and online presence and his marketing reflected the quality of service that he gave. And so that was the problem that we were going to try to solve for him through this rebranding process. So what you see here on screen is the logo that Ben had when he came to me. It was a dark grey circle with the word Fresh and Productions underneath. Quite minimal, and he'd been using that. It was on all of his social media channels and his website. Website was quite basic, and Ben had put that together himself. So there wasn't really anything that we wanted to hold on to or carry forward. So one of the first things that I will do with the client is we will have like a brand strategy conversation where I will ask certain questions. We will talk about core values, their purpose, any vision that they have for the company, and what is their onlyness. We talked about taglines, we talk about potential color schemes and the tone of voice for the brand, so the personality that the brand will have. We also look at their ideal client, their industry as a whole, who the competitors are in business to business or business to consumer. And I also ask them to get feedback from their clients, because getting feedback from having my clients get feedback from their clients can be a bit of an eye-opener, just asking them, in a few words, how would you describe us? How would you describe our service? And there can be some great nuggets come out of that can really help the process go forward. And so I usually get the clients to do that after we've had our first strategy session, so that when we come back and meet again, we've got some new input that we can put into hopefully, creating a new path that we can take when it comes to working on the brand identity. I take some notes. There's a few interesting things came out when speaking to Ben. He came up with a great, when we were talking about the personality and how he felt the language would be with the new branding and the copy that he would write. And he said that he had an emoji relationship with most of his clients, where it might be text messaging or email, but they would use emojis a lot to convey the messaging. And I think a lot of people do that these days, but that's the first time that I've actually had a client come to me and say that that's how he works with his suppliers and his own customers, is that he wants to have an emoji relationship with them, which is really sort of relaxed, not too corporate. So that was great. That really helped a lot to see the personality behind it all. Ben also wanted to kind of be this one-stop shop for events, management, production, and staging. Ben wanted to be there for all of that, and he can do that, and he can do it all over the world, and he has the case studies to show that. So we wanted to get across that they could do that, but without saying one-stop shop. So we're also, whilst thinking about the visual branding, thinking about things like taglines and strap lines. Whilst we were going through everything else, this would be in the back of our minds, and we would be working on that. We did create an onlyness statement after many iterations, and that's what you can see here on the screen in blue. And it was fresh is the go-to for delivering successful, stress-free events for businesses and organizations anywhere in the world. So that's quite a short, concise onlyness statement that gets across exactly what Fresh Productions can and will do. And so with all of that there, I was then able to then go and do the next stage, which for me is to look at Ben's competitors. So first thing to do is I go and look at the logos. What branding do the competitors have? You know, what's good, what's bad. There are a lot of event management companies out there, but I was wanting to look at companies who were slightly bigger than Ben's company or around about the same size. I wasn't too bothered about anyone smaller because that wasn't really going to be much of an issue for Ben. So had a look at the landscape to see what was out there. Some pretty terrible ones, and there were some logo designs which I quite liked, but it was good to sort of see if there were any commonalities in colour, shapes, typography. You know, do we want Ben's to fit in with that, or do we want it to stand out and capture attention? So it was good to look at that, and I also looked at all of their websites because that can give a good indication of the types of language that they use, how they manage photography, and what their brand identity looks like overall, because some can have a really nice looking logo, but the rest of their branding sucks. Or they might have a pretty terrible logo, but in actual fact, the way that they handle their branding is done really well. So you can't judge a book by its cover almost. You know, you can't say they've got a great logo in isolation, that means everything else will be great, because sometimes it isn't. So it was really interesting to go through lots of different styles of how they market themselves. Some more successful than others, some a little bit amateur looking, some really high end looking. And it was good to, you know, see where we needed to be and what we needed to do in order to stand out and be different and attract new customers for Ben, and to let his existing customer base see how he is leveling up his business and his service. So yeah, we kind of looked through here, and it was interesting, took down some notes, had another few meetings with Ben where we discussed all of this, and we gave our feedback and we gave our thoughts on everything and where we should be. And at that point, I then start sketching. So I used to use paper sketchbooks, but now I do it mostly using my iPad Pro, and I don't really have any idea to start with. I'll usually start with a word map of words which are related to the business and the area and the services, and from the notes that we did on the first session, and then I will just start sketching out random ideas. When I start sketching, as I say, I don't have really an idea of what the final concept will be. I want to explore everything, so I don't limit myself. I just sketch anything that pops into my head. It goes down onto my iPad Pro so that later on I can analyze everything as a whole. As I'm sketching, I need to do it for at least an hour, get through all of the obvious ideas and start to move into areas that haven't been explored, and we'll start to introduce interesting concepts that we can move forward with. Once I've moved on from the sketching stage, I start to pick out ideas from those sketches which have potential. So one of the ideas that came from the sketching was in some way to be able to use lighting. Lighting plays a big part in events. If you have really good lighting, it can really change a room and change the atmosphere in the room. So I wanted to see if there was some way that I could use the lighting effects. One of the concept ideas was, well, let's take a look at all of the elements that are involved with events and, and staging. And so light beams came into that, but then you also have things like the trussing, which is used to create the structures around stages and to hold up banners and things like that. So that was really interesting, and there was a lot of triangular shapes there. And so we started to explore using these triangular shapes and how they're used in events, for gobo lighting, where you have lasers and kind of projection onto the walls and they spin. And so we started looking at that and how light can cut across shapes. And it was quite an exciting concept, actually. And it was, it has a lot of potential. And we started really looking at that. And I was thinking, this is one of those projects where the concept has come quite quickly, which is sometimes a good sign. But you need to be careful that you don't, just lock onto that. You still have to be open for that maybe changing further down the line. But this one seemed pretty solid. And so we looked at different shapes and how we could do things with the light, with the light effects and the triangles and the cutting across the beams, and started to solidify that down. We moved from sketching on iPads and paper into our software to create more finished looking designs that we could work with. And I wanted to make sure that these shapes would work with text. So started looking at typography. And speaking to Ben, we agreed that we wanted something which looked fairly modern. We wanted something that was a sans serif rather than a serif. Nothing too complicated, but had a presence. And so started looking at lots of different typefaces. I can go through hundreds trying to find the right one, the one that's kind of going to stand out and work. And I eventually found one that I thought was modern, and it just had a nice friendly feel to it. And that was called, it was from the typeface Montreux Grotesque, and it was the Montreux Jazz version of it. And so we started to look at the fonts within there and look at the different weights, and we wanted something that was fairly heavy. So we started to bring type across and marry it to the conceptual shapes that we'd been coming up with. And for me, it was like, this is working. I like this. This is actually, this is probably going to work. But then, as I have to think about how the logo will work at very small sizes as well as very large sizes. And the problem that was going to happen with the logos that we had, for example, any of these here, if I make these really small, then the really thin lines will start to disappear, or they start to clump together, and you lose the idea, you lose the concept of the light beams going across. And so this was a concern for me, and I wanted to make sure that we came up with something which was versatile. It's one of the rules for coming up with a new logo, is it has to be versatile, it has to be adaptable. It can't always be at the size we would like it to be. It will be used in all sorts of situations, so it needs to be able to cope with that. So it was, in a way, it was kind of like taking a step back, but not too far back. We still like the idea of the lights or the lines cutting across shapes, but we needed to see if we could do that in a slightly different way. And so whilst I was looking at different ways of doing that, whilst I've been speaking to Ben early on, he has, there is an item that he hires out for events, and it's this huge inflatable dome. And when I say huge, it's not the size of a tent, it's the size of a massive marquee, inflatable. It can be, you can put lights inside it and light it from the outside. You can also get skins that will go over it. It's a great piece of kit, and it's something that, you know, Ben hires out and gets a really great response from. And so I was looking at this a little bit more, and I happened to find a photograph of the inside looking up, and it was quite intriguing to me. I just loved the pattern that it formed, and so I took the photograph into Adobe Illustrator, the software I use when I'm working on logos, and traced these lines to give the pattern that you can see on the screen here. And I thought that's really good. I like that. There's something in this. And for me, what it represented was it almost represented the trussing, it represented the lights, but it also started to represent a speaker. And so you have, you know, sound is a big thing from events and staging as well. So it was like, wow, we're starting to bring a lot into this. I'm thinking it could also be a microphone. So it's like, this is really starting to pull in all the elements of everything around events. I started to work with it and start to thicken up the lines, because in the previous concept the lines were quite thin, and so that's when they were disappearing, when the shapes got quite small. So when I was working on that and creating it, I made sure to thicken up parts of the symbol so that when we were working at small sizes, it wasn't going to be so much of an issue. There were different variations that we could do by removing certain circles, removing certain lines. We could have it as an outline type shape, or as you can see here on the right, we could fill the spaces in and make the lines white to see which one would work best. When I did that, I liked the solidity of the filled in version more than the outline version, but I was still open to both. We were also considering whether in the name Fresh, whether it should be an uppercase F or a lowercase f. By going lowercase, it softens things a little bit and makes it a little bit, to me, a little bit more modern. A lot of more modern kind of tech type brands use lowercase lettering, and tech is, you know, is the industry that Ben is in. And I liked that more than the capital. And I pretty much made my decision early on. I discussed it with Ben, but I decided that it probably would all be a lowercase element for the logo type part of the logo design. Eventually settled on these two, the filled in version and an outline version, and the lowercase, and we hadn't really finalized what the tagline was underneath, but I had said to Ben that because his company was called Fresh Productions, but he wanted to shorten it down, you know, to just Fresh. But then that could infer food, or, you know, just keeping things fresh rather than a fresh approach to events. And so I felt that we did need to have a strap line underneath which did explain what the industry was. So event production and management was what we dropped in there in the short term, just so that was there so that we could balance out the design to make sure that everything was the right size when we were working with it. The next thing to do was to then look at colour. And when we had our first discussions, Ben had some quite strong opinions on colour. He wanted it to be bright. And so we were looking again at lighting and looking at some photography from previous events that Ben had done. and magentas and cyans and purples were quite prominent, and they're bright, and they just had the right feel. So we didn't really explore too much. I did use my Pantone books. I always use my Pantone color books when I'm choosing color, so that I can make sure that if I'm choosing a color for a logo, that if we need to use a Pantone and a CMYK version, that they are quite similar. With colors, when it comes to Pantone and CMYK printing, you can have quite large differences. If the color is really bright, like a very bright orange, or like a lime green or neon green, for example, it will look really vibrant in a Pantone solid spot color, and it will look really vibrant on your screen because your screen is RGB, which is additive coloring, and that's quite bright. But with printing, it's CMYK, which is subtractive, and so you don't get the vibrancy that you can with Pantone and RGB. So we need to be careful with that, and there's a lot of considerations that need to be made there, and not something that can be rushed. So if you are having a logo design, make sure that it's not just being designed as RGB for on screen if you're going to need it to be printed, because you could have some serious issues in contrasting differences between screen and print. Just something to be aware of. So we moved forward and started to apply these colors, different variations of this. I think in here you can see on this one here that we explored quite a few different colors to see which ones would balance up. And I also tested, to see how white versions would work on dark backgrounds. Is it going to work in one color as much as is it going to work in full color? So we got to this stage and we kind of presented how that was going to work. And I always allow time between coming up with a concept and showing it to the client and giving them time to think about it and myself time to think about it. So we gave it a little while, probably 3 or 4 days, and then we came back and spoke to one another on our thoughts on what we'd been doing, what we've been working on. And Ben had reservations about it. He wasn't entirely sure that this was quite right. We thought it maybe looked a little bit like the Death Star. Just when you get certain inferences that lead people to think about one thing or another, it can put doubts in your mind, and Ben wasn't quite sure about how this was working, and we'd gone back and sort of looked at where we were at nearer the start with it, and how we had the more just all straight lines cutting through the shape rather than the curves which we'd introduced because of the inflatable. And as Ben had said, the inflatable is only it's one part of his business. It isn't the entirety, it isn't even the main part of his business. So to maybe base the logo off of one element like that wasn't right. Whereas the lighting side of it and the trussing, the angular, shapes did make more sense. So what we then did was I went away and looked at rethinking this again. So going back to the lighting, the trussing, we had the speaker shape, which I kind of still liked that idea, and we had the inflatable, and we had all the lighting. So we took the lighting effect that we'd been using just to kind of work on the colors, and what I did is I turned those into outlines rather than filled gradient shapes, and I then took those shapes and overlaid them on the circle, which would reflect, the speaker element that we'd had before, to see what would happen. And I tried all different orientations of this and moving it around, and until I found what I felt was the best one. Took the space out of the middle to make it more of a donut type shape, because I wanted some space for it to breathe. It felt too heavy with having it sort of all as one with this center part, and I wanted it to look more open. So we did that, and we ended up with this final shape here, which I then added some color to. So we're like, yeah, this is much closer. This is more like it. This is really starting to work for us. I did a couple of mock-ups to show how it could potentially work on a web page, having the logo up at the top there, and as you can see down here in the bottom left, using elements of the logo as background details on the website, and just on graphics that he might share on social, and coming up with, taglines and things for the different elements, and see how color would work. What would the brand identity work with in terms of like the purples, the magentas. You can see here how this is the dome lit using different colored lighting, and I've added in the cross beams here, which come from the lighting here. We can use that as well as a decorative element. So we're getting really close. We're getting really close. Again, we have a break. We go away, and we talk about it. And Ben's not sure about the three colors. And it's mainly the cyan blue. Ben wasn't too sure about that. Personally, I wasn't too sure about it myself. It kind of complicated things a little bit, and so we made the decision to just drop it to the purple and the magenta. And when we dropped it to just the purple and the magenta, and tried to, when we were creating the filling in the shape, so I had to remove the blue and then alternate. I had it alternating from magenta to purple, magenta to purple, magenta to purple, all the way around. And it looked fine. But we had a thought where, well, what if we use a gradient? Because if we use a gradient and go from purple through to magenta, then that's how the lighting works. You have lights crossing over one another, creating this gradient effect and merging seamlessly from one color to the other. I don't normally advocate using gradients because you can have some potential problems when it comes to printing. But because we were moving from purple to magenta, the actual gradient is really smooth. There aren't too many colors that need to make up that gradient. So you're not going to really end up with you can end up with banding. And you'll see that sometimes if you zoom in on a gradient, you'll see bands where the colors are changing over to the next one. These two colors, luckily, don't really have much of that going on. So it's quite a smooth gradient across. And one other thing which we changed was originally the shape was like this. Now you may not notice it, but when we noticed it, we saw it. There's actually an arrow shape. So if we follow my cursor, there's like a downward pointing arrow, and we didn't feel that gave the right sort of subtle messaging. So all we did was we just took it and we rotated it 180 degrees so that arrow was pointing upwards. It's just more positive. So the next thing to do was to then sort of test it out in different places, did a mock-up new web page to see how it would work and how it would sit, working in with the colors, using the elements from the lighting, and a few other mock-ups as we've looked at these two already. Ben wanted some embroidery. He wanted to get some polo shirts done with some embroidery. Now, you can kind of replicate gradients in embroidery, but this is where banding will come in. So we made the decision that where embroidery would be used, the symbol would be one color and the lettering would be the second color, so purple and magenta. And it worked really well. For that, you can see here how the logo would work on some polo shirts. Because it's such a simple design, nice chunky shapes, really chunky lettering, it will work really well in terms of embroidery on any materials. That's that versatility and adaptability coming in again. Then we move on to some t-shirts, and with t-shirts we've got printing, so gradients will be a little bit easier to do, so we can really work and keep the logo design as is. But with t-shirts we can start to introduce these secondary design elements again with the light beams, and taking parts of the logo's icon or symbol and increasing that and using that as high impact in terms of branding. Things like water bottles, which are really popular today, badges for merchandise, lanyards, as Ben does a lot of events. You know, it's always good to have your own branded lanyard that you can attach the laminate onto, so that, you know, you're constantly promoting your own brand. So we want to make sure that we could come up with something that would work really well for that. Vehicles, again, important for moving all of that equipment around. Created some vehicle livery. We went through a few different design options and finally settled on this one for Ben, using the arrow shape, not quite like FedEx in the FedEx logo, but using the arrow shape from part of the logo to suggest forward momentum with the van. So we can kind of play around with those sections. That worked really well too. And then finally, you know, everyone needs some stationery, so I created some stationery designs. These actually had some spot varnish on them, so the light beams had some spot varnish on the front of the card, and then on the reverse, the darker section of the logo's icon had some spot varnish on there as well, so the cards looked really, really, really fantastic in person. Once the logo design was finished, I create a file package for my client which contains their logo in all the multiple file formats. That's EPS, PDF, PNG, JPEG and SVG, and I will give them in different layouts, so the logo in a horizontal view and a stacked view, and it will also be in full color, one color and reverse options. So I provide a file package which basically covers any possible situation that may be required for on-screen or in print. And then I will also create a logo guidelines document that specifies the typography which is used, the colors which are used, and some simple rules on what to, you know, how to show the logo with correct spacing around it and not to squash it or change the colors. That can be really helpful for the client for reference, but also it's useful if the client needs to send their logo off to someone to be replicated anywhere. They can send that logo guidelines document along with it, and then they'll know that their logo will always be reproduced in the way that it was intended. And the last thing was that Ben really needed to get his website updated, and so I'd recommended that Ben work with the guys at Jammy Digital, who are experts in building WordPress websites, and Ben desperately needed to get his website redone, and so that is now up and live. So if we take a look now at the website which has now been completed for Ben, you can see how it reflects everything that we've done, everything that we've worked for in creating the new brand identity. The guys at Jammy have done a great job. We've got the color scheme, we've got background shapes which are reflective of elements of the logo. It's really nicely paced. It's a good resource for clients and anyone that's looking for any advice on how to, you know, set up an event. Ben's really good and forward with all that sort of information. So his website was going to be an important hub of information for people who are looking to hire his type of service, but also just as a helpful hub for people wanting to find out what's involved. If they have got an event that they need to organize, then it's better that they're on Ben's website looking for that information to create it, because when they do need help with setting it up, then hopefully they would think of Fresh Productions because they were so helpful in the planning process. I know that Ben is really happy with what we've ended up with. I'm really happy with what we've ended up with. It probably, like any logo design, it's ended up in a place where I couldn't have thought it would at the start, from that early sketching process where I was focusing on the letter F and trying to do something with the letter F because of